In our previous video, we were looking at different types of data, and we defined data based on whether or not it was primary or secondary data. Primary, new data gathered to solve the current problem. Secondary data, data gathered for another purpose. And so we want to just look at other types of data and how they are defined. Another way to define your data is to whether it is quantitative or qualitative. So quantitative with an N in it is numerical. We can analyze it using math. So we can focus on the frequency of this type of data. How often do people do a certain activity? What percentage feel a certain way? We can look at central tendencies like mean, median, and mode. What is the average height or weight of what's the average temperature, depending on what we're trying to measure. And with quantitative data, we look at how much variability there is. So is everyone the same weight, or is there quite a lot of variety? Is every product we make the same number of ounces if we're filling bottles of Coke, or is there a lot of variability? So when we look at quantitative data, this is going to be our surveys. We can take data like multiple choice questions and figure out what percentage gave each response. Structured observations. In our previous video, we were looking at how many cans they looked at, how long they spent looking at cans. Those are all things that we can analyze quantitatively. What's the average amount of time spent looking at a can of soup? So those are all quantitative. When we collect information into databases, we will often have information like if we have a call center, how long are people on the call? How many times have customers been contacted? What's the dollar amount that someone spent? Those types of things, quantitative. We can analyze, we can find the average number. We can find out how much variability. In comparison, qualitative data is data that cannot be analyzed using math. Typically, it's in some kind of text form. So if we do an interview, we ask people and they respond, they give us words. Those words get captured. If we're doing a focus group, we have 8 to 12 people giving us words, and we capture that. And so when you are doing qualitative data, we're looking for themes. Is there commonality in what is being said? When we do open-ended survey questions, so we ask for people's feedback. What was your best experience at a grocery store? What was your worst experience in terms of a course you're taking, right? So these are very open-ended. They can write anything they want in them. And so because everyone can answer very differently and provide very different information, then you have to analyze it based on themes. You can't look at frequency truly because everyone didn't have the same option to choose a particular topic. So we're just looking at commonalities and themes as opposed to frequency. Unstructured observations, you'll recall from the previous video, that is where you are simply writing what you're observing. And so because it allows for that level of detail, as you're explaining everything that's happening, again, we're looking for themes, but we're not quantifying it because one observer or one point in time, an observer might note something and another time not. So we need to distinguish between quantitative and qualitative because the analysis is different. We're going to get into natural language processing with machine learning. We're going to do that with more qualitative data. When we do our more descriptive statistics, like you're doing in stats, then it is more quantitative data. We also need to identify what type of measurement scale we have. That's going to determine what type of analysis we do. And so we have nominal, ordinal, interval, and ratio. So nominal is a question that has categories. What province do you live in? And you choose Alberta, BC, PEI. So the responses here, you have a choice. It's limited choice, but they're not numbers. They are categories. Okay, so we might see that type of question on a survey. What we can do then is we can treat this information, even though it's text, we can treat it as if it's quantitative because we have limited the number of options, because you have to choose from a list, Alberta, BC, PEI, and it's not a write-in. That means that we can then look at the frequency. So what percentage of our respondents are from Alberta? Okay. So if we, depending on what measurement scale we have, we can analyze it differently. Ordinal data is data that has ranking. So we often use Likert scales when we do surveys. And so it is categories here, but there is some kind of order to it. So we might have a statement that says the website was easy to use, and your choices are strongly agree, agree, neutral, disagree, strongly disagree. And so there is a difference, right, between the strongly agree category and the strongly disagree category in terms of preference, right? Whereas the nominal, Alberta, BC, there's no ranking or order to it. So with the Likert scale, and we'll talk later in terms of analysis of ordinal type data, there are different analytical methods if you identify that you have ordinal data. Interval data has increments, so we have numbers here, and there is a meaning to how far apart the numbers are, but the number 0 is arbitrary. So for example, we might have a question, the cake was baked at what temperature, and we record 400 Fahrenheit. Well, 0 Fahrenheit is still a temperature, so it's an interval. As opposed to ratio data, the difference, the increments have meaning, but 0 means that the event did not occur, that the item doesn't exist. So with interval, there is a difference between 200 and 400 Fahrenheit, right? 200 difference. It's the same difference as between 100 Fahrenheit and 300 Fahrenheit. Okay, but the 0 doesn't mean an absence of temperature. Whereas with ratio, if we ask the question, how many cakes were baked, then if we said 0 cakes, then no cakes were made. So 0 has meaning, and it means there were none. We have, when it comes to ratio data, we have discrete, which means it has to be whole numbers. So we'll call this in Python integer. And then we also have data that is ratio, like what's the dog's weight? Well, we're measuring it, 10.5 pounds. If the dog weighs 0 pounds, the dog doesn't exist. In this case, we can have fractions of numbers, and so then we have more continuous data. We can have all the numbers in between, not just the whole numbers. So whether our data is discrete or continuous, whether we have interval or ratio, nominal or ordinal, will impact the type of analytics, the type of tools and methods that are appropriate. So we have our quantitative or qualitative data, and we have our measurement scales, and interval and ratio, of course, are quantitative. Nominal and ordinal, because we are restricting the options, even though it's categories or categories that have ranking or order to them, even though they're text, because we're limiting the number of options, we can treat them as if they're quantitative. So the data we have from surveys, focus groups, observational research, we've talked about that primary data before, but there is a lot more types of data. We can pull data from databases, so we can have secondary data analysis from a database maybe on the customers, who we contact, who contact us, their level of interest. We can have databases that are related to enterprise resource planning. So this is tying together our manufacturing, our customer orders, our employee scheduling. As we tie together all this information within a business, all of this data is tied together into a database so we can use it to see relationships. Who do we schedule to work? How much is produced? How much gets sold? How much are customers ordering? How much inventory do we need? And so we have databases also that are supply chain management. So if we need materials from a supplier, we need to provide our product to a distributor. All of that information that gets coordinated is shared in that type of database. So these are all types of data. And then it goes even beyond that. We have text data, right? We have our organization's documents. We have web information on the web that also is typically in text form. We have data that's in terms of pictures or images. And so we can identify what's happening, what's the theme, what images are seen. We can track movement. We can look at audio. So we can analyze what is said and recorded. Now, audio analytics is beyond the scope of the videos that we're going to cover here. It's quite complex. We'll cover the rest of these, but audio we'll reserve for future exploration. Spatial data or reality mining is where we are looking at information based on a map. So geographical information systems overlays the data onto where it's happening. And so another data source to consider as well. So for all these data sources, we can put them into the categories of primary versus secondary. Surveys, focus groups, observational research, primary data collected to help solve the current problem. The rest of these are typically secondary data. So we have them for some other purpose. Whether we collected audio from sales calls or from announcements to our stakeholders, that audio exists. We can now analyze it to make further predictions. Maybe we have images that we're collecting to identify all of our inventory or to look at and observe what's happening, security camera footage. And we can mine that to identify things in the image. We have websites and we have social network data, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, X, and we can actually mine those, get text to get information there. We might be collecting information in our operations and our processes for quality management purposes, where we're trying to use sensors to identify defects before they happen. And we can use that, of course, to also streamline and improve our operations. And then we have databases where we have information about customers, information about employees, information about suppliers, information about operations. All of this we can then use to further analyze, to create solutions to new problems. So many of this is secondary data gathered for another purpose. We can take those different types of data and we can also classify them by structured versus unstructured data. This is a bit different from the structured, unstructured observational research. Same idea, but different application here. So when it comes to structured data, remember structured observation was it a checklist? Structured data is, can we put it into a table? Unstructured data is data that cannot be put into a table. So text, if we are looking at documents, that's going to be unstructured data. It doesn't fit nicely into a table. Audio data, images, right, doesn't fit nicely into a spreadsheet. Think, can I put it into Excel? Whereas the other types of data we've been talking about, even the unstructured observational research, we can put into a table. And really what's defining whether or not we can put it into a table is whether we can track each person's response or each question or each time a phenomenon happens, where we can put in the next piece of information. So for example, if we are taking a survey, we can turn it into a table because we can take each person, they're a row, each column, it's a question, and their responses to each can populate that table. Even open-ended questions on the survey can fit into the table because we have a different respondent and a different question, and we would put that text into that box. So it's a structured data. With our focus group, we have a particular key question from our focus group. We have response number 1, response number 2, right? We have the 20 comments that were made in the focus group, and each one of those can be a row underneath that question. So it can be put in as structured data. Our observational research, where we talk about how many people looked at Campbell's soup, right? Did they look at Campbell's soup? Yes, it's one person's response. And whether or not they looked at Campbell's soup is the column, and we could have yes, no, check, X. So that structured observational research is structured data. The unstructured observational research, where you're writing up what did each person do. Again, each row is a person, each column is their behavior. And so that one can be treated like structured data because we have multiple observations. Whereas in the unstructured data, when we have a bunch of text documents, we have, you can't put a 20-page report right into an Excel file. So when the text is smaller and there's multiple of it, we can put it into the structured data. So text can kind of go in between depending on how much you have. The databases, when we're looking at our customer relationship management, and we'll look at an example of that in coming videos, is structured data. And then your spatial data, where you're going to have occurrences and you're going to have a longitude and a latitude. Well, one field in your database is going to be longitude, one field is going to be latitude, one column or field is going to be the event or the number of events that happened at that location. And so it can be put into a table. So whether we have structured or unstructured data is going to be particularly relevant as we look at things like MySQL, the ability to query data and pull it out to analyze. And there are different ways to store information, whether it can be put into a table or not. In a later video, we will look at using MySQL in Google Cloud to pull from a database. And so that is pulling from a structured data set that's in table form. And as we get to analyzing text and images, we're then dealing with unstructured data, and our techniques are going to be different. So we've looked at structured versus unstructured data. We've looked at primary versus secondary data. We've looked at data types based on the source of data. We've looked at whether data is quantitative or qualitative. And we've talked about how different measurement scales can help us identify the data that we have so that we can determine what type of analytics is appropriate.